For years, we were shown a story that didn't quite add up. A family that claimed unity while quietly falling apart behind the scenes. Now, the silence is breaking, and the truth is surfacing piece by piece. This isn't about anger or divorce, it's about control, image, and the moment everything finally unravels. And what happens next changes the story forever. Stay with me, because once you see this, you won't look at any of it the same way. What makes this entire situation so unsettling is not just a disappointment being expressed, but the deeper sadness underneath it. Because when someone says they received no tenderness, no kindness, no empathy during one of the most painful transitions of their life, it tells us that the emotional disconnect did not begin at the moment of separation. It existed long before the word divorce was ever spoken. And from the very beginning of this family structure, there was an unspoken rule that certain feelings were allowed while others were quietly discouraged. And early on, it became clear that voicing frustration about another wife did not lead to understanding or resolution. It led to discomfort, avoidance, and silence. And so those emotions were buried, pushed down, and ignored, creating an environment where survival replaced vulnerability. And over time, that survival mode hardened into patterns that became normalized. And what followed was not honesty, but image management. And what was presented as unity was often just compliance. And when disagreements arose, they were framed as personal failures rather than symptoms of a deeply unbalanced system. And this is where the disappointment grows, because accountability was never evenly distributed. And when someone questioned behavior or motives, they were labeled difficult or disloyal. And this dynamic repeated for years until the weight of it became impossible to carry. And while the narrative now attempts to simplify everything into a single issue, a single personality trait, or a single flaw, the reality is far more layered. Because this was not one moment or one argument. This was a slow erosion of trust caused by years of emotional absence and deflection. And what makes the current storyline so tense is the attempt to rewrite that history, as though viewers have not been watching and listening and remembering. And when apologies are offered that focus solely on early misunderstandings without addressing years of repeated behavior, they feel incomplete and strategic. And the audience senses that disconnect immediately. Because protecting someone means standing with them consistently, not explaining away neglect after the fact. And the children noticed the distance, not because they were told to, but because they lived inside it. They experienced the separation long before it was acknowledged, and they asked questions because what they saw did not match what they were being told. And instead of addressing that reality, the concern shifted toward appearances, toward how things looked rather than how they felt. And that choice revealed priorities that were never truly about healing. And as time passed, those priorities became clearer, because while some relationships were nurtured, others were allowed to wither, and the imbalance was justified rather than corrected. And this is where the tension tightens, because viewers have witnessed the favoritism, the shifting standards, the selective accountability, and the repeated insistence that leadership existed even while responsibility was denied. And when someone says they were not protected, what they are really saying is that they were left alone emotionally, repeatedly, and intentionally. And that abandonment does not disappear simply because it is later acknowledged. It leaves marks, and those marks shaped every interaction that followed. And as the story continues to unfold, there is an effort to frame the past as chaotic but unintentional, as though no one could have known better. And yet, the patterns remained unchanged for over a decade, and that consistency tells a different story, one of choice, not confusion. And what makes this moment so compelling is that the audience now sees through the framing and understands that anger is not the cause of the breakdown. It is the result. And when anger is isolated without context, it becomes a convenient distraction. And this is why the apology feels hollow to those who lived the consequences. Because accountability requires more than words. It requires ownership of the harm caused across time and space and relationships. And while there is an attempt to shift blame toward interpersonal conflicts between the women, the truth is that those conflicts were fostered, encouraged, and never truly resolved because division served a purpose. And as long as the tension stayed focused on tension between wives, the central imbalance remained unchallenged. And this strategy worked for years, until it did not. And now the cracks are impossible to ignore, because those who were once expected to remain silent are speaking with clarity and calm. And that calm is far more disruptive than anger, because it cannot be dismissed. And as this chapter begins to close, it becomes clear that the story being told no longer aligns with the reality that was lived, and the audience is watching not just for drama, but for truth. And that truth has been building quietly, patiently waiting for the moment when silence was no longer required. And this is only the beginning, because once the foundation of the narrative begins to crumble, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. And what comes next will challenge every version of the story that has been carefully maintained until now. As the structure that once held everything together begins to weaken, the most unexpected shift is not confrontation, but alignment. Because after years of being positioned on opposite sides, individuals who were once framed as incompatible begin to recognize that the true source of conflict was never each other, but the system that kept them divided. And this realization changes everything, because unity among those who were previously isolated threatens the balance of power that depended on their separation. And once that separation dissolves, control loses its leverage. And this is why the response is not relief, but resistance, because systems built on hierarchy do not survive cooperation. And as these women begin navigating the process of closure together, what unfolds is not just personal healing, but a quiet dismantling of authority that once dictated their choices. And the act of seeking release becomes symbolic, representing not just an end to a relationship, but an end to the belief that permission must be granted to move forward. And what makes this moment so striking is how quickly the process unfolds, not because compassion suddenly appeared, but because visibility changed the stakes. And when actions are taken under public awareness, motivations shift, outcomes accelerate, and narratives adjust to avoid scrutiny. And this creates a tension that runs beneath every scene, because it raises questions about how many others remain unheard, unseen, and bound by rules that only bend when exposed. And as this reality sinks in, the story expands beyond one family and becomes a reflection of broader themes of autonomy, belief, and emotional survival. And still, through all of this, there is an effort to redirect responsibility, to suggest that these decisions are driven by bitterness or influence rather than clarity. But that framing collapses under its own weight, because clarity does not require permission, and the more composed these women become, the less effective those tactics appear. And as unity strengthens, retaliation becomes predictable, not dramatic, but calculated attempts to reopen old wounds, to revive old divisions, to suggest ulterior motives where none exist. And yet, something has shifted permanently, because once individuals stop questioning their own memories and start trusting their lived experience, control loses its grip. And that loss is irreversible. And this is why the tension continues to build, because the narrative that once depended on silence now faces voices that are steady, consistent, and unafraid. And the audience recognizes this shift immediately, because it feels different from the cycles that came before. There is no chaos, no shouting, no reactionary emotion, only deliberate movement forward. And that composure unsettles those who relied on volatility to maintain influence. And as the story continues, there will be attempts to rewrite intentions, to cast cooperation as betrayal and independence as aggression, but those efforts ring hollow, because the foundation they once stood on has already cracked. And what we are witnessing is not reconciliation or revenge, but reclamation of self. And that reclamation disrupts every structure that required submission to function. And as this chapter progresses, the consequences of that disruption begin to surface, because power that is no longer reinforced begins to collapse inward. And the audience watches, not with shock, but with recognition, because they have seen the pattern long enough to know what happens when truth replaces performance. And as the final pieces fall into place, it becomes clear that this story is no longer about who left or who apologized, but about who finally stepped out of the narrative they were assigned. And once that happens, the ending is no longer controlled by those who benefited from the silence. And the next chapter will not be defined by conflict, but by the absence of it. And that absence is what ultimately exposes how fragile the illusion of control always was. As the aftermath begins to settle, the most revealing element is not what is said publicly, but what is no longer being defended, because silence now carries a different meaning than it once did. And where silence used to signal compliance, it now signals distance and detachment. And that shift is unsettling for anyone who relied on constant reassurance to maintain control. And what unfolds next is a subtle but undeniable change in posture, tone, and intention. Because those who once explained themselves repeatedly no longer feel the need to justify their choices. And that absence of justification becomes its own statement. And this is where the suspense deepens, because the audience realizes that the story is no longer moving in circles, it is moving forward. And forward movement cannot be managed the way stagnation can. And as past behaviors are revisited, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Repeated promises followed by minimal change, selective accountability paired with grand explanations, and emotional labor placed disproportionately on those with the least authority. And when that dynamic is finally acknowledged, it reframes every prior interaction and every past conflict. And suddenly, moments that were once dismissed as misunderstandings reveal themselves as warnings that went unheeded. And this realization does not arrive with chaos or confrontation, it arrives with clarity and calm, which makes it even more powerful, because calm does not seek permission. And as the individuals who were once expected to hold everything together step back, the structure itself begins to reveal its weaknesses, because it was never built on mutual support, it was built on endurance, and endurance has limits. And those limits have now been reached. And what makes this phase so compelling is that there is no dramatic explosion, no final argument, no single moment that can be isolated and blamed. Instead, there is a gradual withdrawal of belief, and once belief is gone, authority becomes symbolic rather than real, and that symbolic authority collapses quickly when no one reinforces it. And the audience senses this shift instinctively, because the energy has changed. Conversations feel different, pauses carry more weight, and responses are no longer reactive but intentional. And this unsettles the old dynamic, because it depended on emotional volatility to reset the balance. And without that volatility, the familiar cycle cannot restart. And as attempts are made to regain footing, they feel increasingly disconnected from the present moment, because the language belongs to an earlier chapter that no longer applies, and the people involved are no longer playing the same roles. And that role refusal is the quiet revolution at the center of this story, because once someone steps out of the part they were assigned, the entire narrative must adjust or collapse, and it is struggling to adjust. And as alliances solidify around shared understanding rather than obligation, the contrast becomes undeniable, because these connections are not based on fear or expectation, but on mutual recognition. And that recognition exposes how unnecessary the previous divisions always were. And as this awareness spreads, the question shifts from who caused the breakdown to why it was sustained for so long. And that question has no comfortable answer, because it implicates choices, habits, and systems rather than individuals. And this is why the reckoning feels incomplete yet inevitable, because while the past cannot be rewritten, its influence can no longer be denied. And as the final threads of the old story loosen, the future takes shape, not as a dramatic victory, but as a steady departure from dysfunction. And that departure is irreversible, because once clarity replaces confusion, there is no incentive to return. and the audience understands that what they are witnessing is not just an ending, but a transformation that removes the need for the very conflict that once defined everything. And as this realization settles, the true weight of the story becomes clear, not through spectacle, but through the quiet certainty that the narrative has permanently shifted, and there is no path back to the version of events that once demanded belief without evidence. And this final stage does not seek validation because it no longer requires it. And that is what ultimately confirms that the power has changed hands, not through force, but through release. What we just witnessed wasn't the end of a family, but the end of a carefully protected illusion. When people stop accepting silence as peace and start choosing clarity, everything shifts. This story isn't finished yet, because the consequences are still unfolding, and the next chapter won't be controlled by the past, but by the truth that can no longer be ignored.